gentleman from Allen County and gentlemen from Washington County who are here speaking to the committee on behalf of the sponsorship of this legislation. Starting with the gentleman from Allen County.
Thank you. Thank you, Speaker Batchel. Thanks for the committee to come today. I especially want to thank the members of this committee. Many other members are out perhaps vacationing and doing other things, and the middle of the summer isn't always the most convenient thing. So, and I know there's not any extra pay for coming to extra committee meetings in the summer. Some of the members here have additional committees in the next 2 weeks and have a full schedule. So, thank you for your indulgence. The primary goal of House Bill 597 is I think very simple. And with most projects or most issues that are complex, which there are many facets to this and therefore complex, you need to start with a very simple question to decide which way you head. And the question simply is, is the state of Ohio at this point going to cut the cord between the state of Ohio and the national consortium as it relates to the standards in our K-12 education, and all of the things that flow from standards, testing, curriculum, textbooks, and a variety of other things. Now, I use the word national consortium, and some may say, what is that? And I'm using that very generic term because I don't think we need to get caught up in a discussion about the influence of the federal government or the lack of influence of the state of Ohio on the drafting of the standards and the testing and the things. But it matters very much in terms of understanding this issue about how decisions get made. And it's very simple that once you decide to join a bigger group or allow influence from a bigger group, you get less influence. You know, if I decided I was going to go out to dinner by myself every weekend, I could go to dinner wherever I wanted to. But when my wife and I are going out together, I can't just pick a place every time. And that's a very simple example, but it's basic human nature that even if you're in the room when decisions are being made, if you're part of a larger group, you have less influence. Now, is that necessarily a bad thing? Well, if you're in the Army, no. You can only have one guy in charge telling you what to do when you're deciding to go up over the hill. But this is a much more complex set of issues, and it's very fundamental because the decision to turn your child over to a group of people for 30 hours a week or more is a very personal decision. So when you do that, you want to make sure that you have as much influence as you can through your local elected school board, through the local principal of your school, your superintendent, your elected state school board members, your elected state legislative leaders, your governor. Those are people that you can talk to. It's difficult for a parent who's upset about the impact of a particular school policy to have influence in the national consortium, this group of people. I don't want to go on too long about why these things grow the way they do. I can give you a lot of examples, and all of you know that. But, you know, when we passed the 16th Amendment for federal income tax, we passed it based on the promise that the income tax would never be larger than 1% of the income. And it would never tax anybody except for the top 5% earners in the United States. Well, that's different now, I think, we would all say. When we invented the EPA in 1970, it was a great idea, and they did great work cleaning up Lake Erie, places like that. We needed the EPA. But today, the EPA is suggesting that if I leave the hose on too long in my backyard and flood it, that now is a waterway of the United States, and the EPA has jurisdiction over what happens in my backyard. The federal government runs a school lunch program. And at St. Rose School in Lima, Ohio, almost all of the kids are on the federal lunch program. Food comes in, they're required to eat vegetables. The kids don't eat their vegetables. And Father Ross has said, we'd like to take all the food that isn't eaten and take it to the soup kitchen. That's our mission. The federal government says, you're not allowed to do that. You have to throw it away. Now, how does that happen? We all know that's a bad decision. Why do these things happen? And on the back end, it happens because when decisions are that far removed from every day, they tend not to make sense when they get filtered down. It's not just in government, it's in business, it's in personal relationships, it all works the same way. So, Matt Huffman, someone can fairly ask this question. Matt, we're not talking about the federal government. We're just talking about some standards. It's just Ohio and some other people getting together and deciding, and Ohio doesn't even have to do it if they don't want to. Well, here's how these things work in my experience, and I've seen it. And there's two reasons why they work that way. I just talked about a couple of examples. The first is a congressman or a senator or a president needs to have issues to run on. They need to introduce bills that show what they stand for. They want to clean up the environment. They want to be tough on crime. They want to help education. Remember George Bush, President 41, saying, "I will be your education president." And when I heard him say that back in 1988, I thought, well, what's the federal government got to do with K through 12 education? Answer, nothing at that time. And all of the things that the federal government has done to attempt to introduce or influence education, K through 12 education, is really done through the power of the purse. We're going to give you money, or we're going to withhold money, if you do things the way we want you to do. Well, that's not based on policy, it's based on power. We have the money, you have to do it the way we say. So we've got this group of folks, Republicans and Democrats, who want to influence policy that the federal government doesn't have authority to influence, and they're going to continue to do that. They're not simply going to say, well, you know, we said it's really this consortium, it's not. They're going to introduce more bills. 5 years, 10 years, 20 years from now, somebody's going to want to be the next education leader in the United States. How do I know that? Look over the past 100 years or so. That's what the federal government does. And it's not a conspiracy. There's not a group of 5 people sitting in a room saying, in 20 years we're going to take over. It's the same pattern of behavior over and over. It's what people do. I want to be important. I'm going to do this. Well, gee, Congressman, is that constitutional? What's that got to do with it? Is the answer. And then there's the follow-up, the next thing that happens. The next thing that happens is there's a whole group of people who become invested in this, both financially and in terms of their own behavior and their expectations about how these things move forward. And so we have folks who are making a lot of money off of windmills. Now, when we talked about this, this was a great idea. Hey, you know, we don't have to dig coal up and oil out of the ground, although those are great professions. I have a refinery in Lima, Ohio. First one in the United States, by the way. But people said, we could just get energy right from the air. Sounds pretty neat. Doesn't really work that way. But now we have millions of people with billions of dollars invested in companies, in stock. Warren Buffett, for example, has said, any business where the government guarantees you get paid money, I'm investing in it. You know, that's good for him. He's smart enough to have figured that out. Now, in K through 12 education, as these standards are changed, however they may be by this national consortium, there are going to be people who become financially invested. There are going to be vendors. There are going to be people who are going to be educational consultants, who are going to sell particular textbooks, tests, all sorts of things. Because, you know, government doesn't do these things ourselves. You know, we do have experts in the Department of Education and smart people, but by and large we have to hire vendors to do these things. The federal government has to hire people to build jet planes, right? So that's naturally the way this is going to grow. You don't have to have a conspiracy to do this. This is how these things always work. EPA, windmills, school lunches, and that's always going to be a good idea at the front end. Who doesn't want better standards for our kids? Who doesn't want our kids to be the most successful and the most competitive in the world? Of course, that's what the banner is going to say. And when the federal government decided we wanted less mayhem on our highways, we wanted people to be safe and fewer kids killed, they lowered the speed limit to 55 miles per hour. It was a great idea. And that was under Ronald Reagan, right? Well, everybody, when you restrict someone's freedom that much, it turned out to be not such a good idea. So now everybody gets to do what they want. But at the beginning, these are all good ideas. And so that's the banner this has flown under, which is making tougher standards to make our kids more competitive. So we're at the beginning of this process, and some folks have said, well, hey Huffman, where you been for 4 years? Well, I had other projects, for one thing, legislatively, as we all do. And this, I guess, began percolating. I'm going to let Representative Thompson talk a little bit more about the history of it. This began percolating a few years ago. There was apparently some presentations to the legislature, but ultimately never legislatively approved. And there is today a natural prejudice which has been created, I think, roughly since the 1970s against elected officials. It's almost as though when you decide to run for office, you step over a line and you're a different person. But it's a republic, folks. We elect officials, we elect people to make decisions. Now certainly those folks can give others the right to make certain decisions, but ultimately the authority to make these very important decisions, fundamental decisions, like turning your child over to another group of people for 30 hours a week, and being required to pay taxes to make sure that that is taken care of. That's a very fundamental decision, and one that ultimately needs to lay in the hands of the legislature. And that's why, since we have not addressed this issue, I thought it was important to try to bring this forward. Some people said, well, why do it now? Well, I work during the summertime, apparently so do members of this committee, and I know Speaker Batchelder and I, as we walk off into the sunset, or Speaker who's got a place out in Wyoming right off into the sunset, we'd like to get some of these important issues taken care of before we leave. So that's really what the fundamental question. Now, are there problems with these Common Core standards? Probably. And what I know and what I've read, and when I heard that we had to get rid of cursive, we no longer were going to teach handwriting, for a guy who's got terrible handwriting, but whose parents have beautiful handwriting, I scratched my head and thought, well, maybe smarter people know more than I do. But, that's something I disagree with. Very minor point, certainly. But even if there weren't, even if we looked at the Common Core standards and we looked at the testing, and there was really no effect on the curriculum in the test books, or no negative effect, even if that were all true, I'm submitting to this committee and ultimately to the General Assembly, this is a bad way to make public policy. Ceding important decisions to national organizations, whatever the influence of the federal government may be, and we'll have some discussion about that, is a bad way to make policy. And ultimately, if we continue to do that, remember, as legislative elected officials, we're the ones held responsible for this. We can't say, sorry, somebody else decided that. And I understand that we can say, well, actually, we're not going to do that. But we all know about inertia. We all know that when a decision gets turned over to a smaller group and they make recommendations to the bigger group, and the bigger group sees that, there's a tendency to say, well, this is kind of complex. I guess we'll just do what they say. And even though local school boards have control of textbooks and curriculum, when they see that the tests that were drafted by this national group to comport with the standards, and they need to teach to that test, well, of course that's going to influence those decisions, and in my mind influence it more than it should, as to what they're going to teach and how they're going to teach it. So there's a lot of complexity to this issue. I'm asking members of the committee to look at this not as to what's going to happen in the 2014 school year, or 15, or 16, but how we're going to make education policy from this time forward in the state of Ohio. And I think we went down that path a few years ago, but it's pretty early in this process. You know, someone had thought maybe you should block grant Medicaid funds in 1965 and let the states decide their own path on what to cover and what not to cover. If we knew then what we knew now, it's not a bad idea. Well, this is pretty early in this process. It's not too late, I would submit, to correct this mistake. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask